Our landlords have been chatting. Yeah, they heard about this competition thing and they didn't like it. They want to put aside their differences and work together. It turns out they can both make more money if they raise their rents at the same time. They met online. No, not on Tinder or Bumble or Scruff. They met through RealPage, a real estate data company. RealPage promises landlords big returns on their investments. They have this software that can algorithmically determine the highest amount a landlord could charge. The more landlords that give RealPage their leasing data, the stronger the algorithm becomes. RealPage is able to tell a landlord how to keep their rents as high as possible by figuring out how much neighboring landlords are charging. It's 2023 and there's nothing wrong with meeting people through an app, and it's perfectly legal. Well, not really. RealPage is facing both a class action antitrust lawsuit and a Department of Justice investigation. It turns out that collecting rents from landlords and then providing recommendations to limit competition could be interpreted as collusion, which is illegal. Like all algorithms, RealPage makes recommendations based on its black box, a set of undisclosed assumptions that drive the analysis. Here, the black box assumes that lowering rent is the worst case scenario, even if it resulted in more vacant units. RealPage enabled landlords to reach levels of rent they never thought possible. RealPage has taken a leading role in increasing rents across the nation, something for which the company has proudly taken responsibility. Here's one of their executives describing their product's impact on the affordability crisis. "I think it's driving it, quite honestly. As a property manager, few of us would be willing to actually raise rents double digits within a single month by doing it manually." Is that voice evil enough? RealPage is a type of property technology company called Proptech. Proptech is driving unimaginable growth for all landlords, but mostly corporate landlords. A corporate landlord is a land-owning company that generates profits for their shareholders. I'll be speaking about corporate landlords for the remainder of this video. RealPage isn't the only PropTech that's helping landlords keep rents high. You probably know about Zillow. It might be hard to swallow, but the primary purpose of Zillow is not to foster a dream realm where we can afford to buy homes. Its primary purpose is actually to collect real estate data. Landlords can use Zillow to quickly find competitors' rents in their area and increase their own rent based on what they see. This is not collusion, for the record. But if Zillow were to tell landlords collectively how to keep all of their rents high and avoid competition, it would be. Anyway, there are a bunch of PropTech companies. Here are a few that you might know. Redfin, Homelight, Open Door, CoStar, Zoomper, Hover, LoopNet, Qualia, Reonomy, CoreLogic. Terrible, awful names. Not all PropTech is inherently harmful, but they do make it easier for corporate landlords to monopolize a market. The corporate takeover of housing is a key element in the housing affordability crisis. In the past few years, academics, activists, and journalists have documented this takeover and the role that PropTech has played. Today, I want to share with you those findings. Let's discuss how we got here, the trouble it's causing, and what we should advocate for to eliminate this harmful system. Part 1. The growth of corporate landlords. By 2015, the majority of apartments in the United States were owned by corporate landlords. And again, a corporate landlord is a property-owning corporation that generates profits for their investors. By 2018, corporations own 59% of all apartments. The number continues to grow. Policies made after World War II have enabled the corporate takeover of housing. These policies include the gutting of public housing programs, the erosion of tenants' protections, the deregulation of the finance industry, and the creation of finance products that commodify housing. The 2008 housing crisis and subsequent recession led to a massive transfer of wealth from the working class to the capitalist class. The wave of foreclosures that swept the nation led to bankruptcy and a loss of stable housing for millions of Americans. These same foreclosed units were purchased cheaply by corporate investors both on the open market and through government-sanctioned programs. Because of their roles and losses in the 2008 housing crisis, the gruesome twosome, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, were placed in a conservatorship overseen by the Federal Housing Finance Agency. As a reminder, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae are government-sponsored enterprises that finance mortgages. For properties that Fannie Mae had acquired through the crash, the Federal Housing Finance Agency created the REO to Rental Pilot Program in 2012. This program offered those foreclosed properties to investors as bulk property portfolios. Freddie Mac began fueling private equity mergers and acquisitions after the crash. To make Freddie Mac financially viable, the Federal Housing Finance Agency fostered billions in loans for mass apartment purchases by corporate landlords. None of these deals had affordability requirements, nor were their rents monitored, despite Freddie Mac's mission to create and preserve more affordable homeownership and rental opportunities. These actions signaled a shift from the government's traditional individual home ownership model towards a corporate ownership model. I mentioned earlier that the federal government created finance products that increased the commodification of housing. One such product is an REIT, a real estate investment trust. REITs are corporate landlords that don't have to pay taxes if 90% of their profits are returned to their shareholders. To attract and maintain investors, all corporations must grow. With 90% of profits being yielded to their investors, REITs pass the cost of growth and property maintenance on to tenants. Most REITs are not residential, but the majority of properties owned by the 10 largest corporate landlords are organized as REITs. In the year 2000, the total value of assets owned by REITs was $65 billion. Since the 2008 housing crash, this value has increased to $812 billion. The pandemic has extended the transfer of wealth that began in 2008. The economic crisis following March 2020 caused a lot of smaller landlords of both single-family and multifamily housing to sell their properties. The single-family rental sector has seen over $50 billion in investor and capital transactions since the start of the pandemic. The multifamily market has seen comparable expansion as well. For example, the largest apartment owner in the US, Starwood Capital Group, saw an increase of 89,000 units between 2021 and 2022. So besides the fact that corporate landlords answer to their shareholders and not to their tenants, what's so bad about their ever-increasing market control? Part 2. Corporate landlord practices and Proptech. Corporate landlords must demonstrate that they are more competitive than other real estate investments to attract and maintain shareholders. At their most aggressive, corporate landlords promise up to 20% in annual returns compared to an REIT's average of about 4%. These sorts of returns require constant growth. But now that the 2008 housing crash foreclosures have been bought up, corporate landlords have developed new strategies to accumulate wealth. The means in which corporate landlords grow their profits and assets are equally the reasons why we should be advocating for government-enforced restrictions on them and resisting their growth by any means necessary. Proptech is part of every piece of the corporate landlord growth strategy I'm about to discuss. Without the emergence and continuing development of Proptech, it's unlikely that corporate landlords would have the control over our housing market that they do today. To give you a sense of the scale and pace of growth of Proptech, RealPage managed 3 million housing units in 2017 and has increased to 19.7 million housing units by 2020. Corporate landlords' primary means of increasing profits are mergers and acquisitions, construction of new units, supply manipulation, cutting costs, fines and fees, and rent hikes and evictions. Let's go through each one. Mergers and acquisitions. What are mergers and acquisitions? Capitalist free market theory holds that competition leads to better deals for the consumer. But to the producer, or in most cases the exploiter, competition is seen as a threat to profits. To eliminate competition, multiple corporations might join forces legally and become one entity. That's a merger. Or a larger corporation may buy out a smaller competitor. That's an acquisition. Corporate landlords do not abstain from this monopolistic tendency, and the government encourages it. As mentioned earlier, Freddie Mac has historically put up billions in debt to foster real estate mergers and acquisitions. Since the housing crash and then the pandemic, corporate landlords have put forth billions of their own to acquire properties to expand their portfolios. While corporate landlords already control the vast majority of dense, walkable cities, they are rapidly expanding their control over the single-family market. Disclaimer: I'm not saying that corporate landlords own a significant amount of single-family properties. They don't, nationally. But where they are present, they may own an entire block or even an entire neighborhood. Proptech is used to help corporate landlords algorithmically identify suitable properties for purchase, typically below market rate rentals in hot markets. Proptech can help a corporate landlord define their niche and dominate that market. For example, There are corporate landlords that focus on acquiring rent-stabilized units, like San Francisco's largest corporate landlord, Veritas. A Proptech algorithm can quickly pick out these properties and assess their risks for purchase, allowing a corporate landlord to move quickly to corner a market that might not be apparent to their competitors. In the case of single-family rentals, these competitors are would-be homeowners who must continue to rent as corporate landlords easily outbid them. The billions of dollars that corporate landlords put forth to eliminate their competition illustrates exactly why free market thinking will not result in increased affordability. Constructing new units. Corporate landlords also build new buildings. I discussed this at length in my first video, but there's more to say. In the urban context, large-scale buildings in just about every case will be owned and operated by a corporate landlord. Every tower and every 5/1 that you see represents an expansion of corporate landlord power. Just like the Proptech algorithms that help corporate landlords determine where to buy existing properties, Proptech is also used to help corporate landlords determine where to build new buildings. In the single-family market, corporate landlord construction can occur at a much larger scale. If a corporate landlord finds a market that has high demand for single-family living, they might build an entire community there. When a corporate landlord develops single-family housing units specifically for them to be rented out, it's called built for rent, or BFR. BFRs are heavily standardized. They're built to reduce construction costs and are increasingly automated, enabling corporate landlords to build in means of generating revenue from their tenants. BFRs also allow landlords to completely control the size of the unit and amenities included, allowing them to fine-tune rents. The BFR industry is exacerbating suburban sprawl in fast-growing metropolitan areas, especially in the Sun Belt. Corporate landlords trying to balance building at the lowest possible cost and renting at the highest possible cost is driving this sprawl. Supply manipulation. Landlords are keeping units off the market. When a landlord withholds a significant number of apartments, it's called warehousing. This time last year, if anyone online dared to say that landlords are willfully constricting supply by keeping units off the market, they would be labeled as a housing truther. Since then, a couple of major things have happened. New York released their housing and vacancy report that estimated hundreds of thousands of units are not being rented out. This included almost 90,000 rent-stabilized units. Then, also in New York City, landlords with vacant rent-stabilized units joined forces as the landlord lobby CHIP, propagandistically called the Community Housing Improvement Program. CHIP is calling for the state legislature to weaken rent control laws, claiming that landlords are unable to make a profit under current laws and therefore unable to provide basic renovations for these vacant units. CHIP has revealed how far landlords will go to protect their right to rent hikes. In this case, withholding thousands and thousands of low-cost units off the market. Finally, as part of this class action lawsuit I mentioned, we have evidence to believe that RealPage has been advising its clients to withhold units to increase asking rents. Yes, indeed, RealPage's black box allegedly recommends pulling units off the market as a means to keep rents as high as possible. In the words of the company, physical occupancy, meaning having a rent-paying tenant, should be sacrificed for economic occupancy, meaning having fewer units on the market and thus more leverage to increase rents. You could call this a capital strike. Landlords are withholding units for the express purpose of increasing their profits and deregulating the housing market for their benefit. Cutting costs. If you're a renter, we've already established that you're likely renting from a corporate landlord. If so, you're probably familiar with their websites or portals. This is a form of Proptech. Corporate landlords use Proptech to maximize revenue by cutting operation costs. They do this through algorithmic rent pricing, reviewing and tracking maintenance requests, creating and screening tenant profiles to retain high-quality tenants, and virtual or self-guided tours. Through this streamlining, corporate landlords require fewer staff members and can minimize risks with tenants who might interrupt their expected returns on investments. This sort of streamlining can lead to general neglect, but it also lends itself well to the next method that corporate landlords use to grow their profits. Fines and fees. Fines and fees are a late capitalist's best friend. We're talking about fines for tenants who have higher utilities usage than projected, late fees on rent or utilities bills, fees for moving out, fees for pets, fees for pest control, fees for landscaping, fees for smart home appliances, charges for emergency plumbing, charges for bulky trash pickup. Our rent pays for nothing. Rent hikes and evictions. These growth strategies are all awful, but the one that's by far the worst is the practice of rent hikes and evictions. I've said this a couple times now, but it's important to remember that corporate landlords have to increase profits year over year if they want to retain and attract investors. Listen to me. They want to retain and attract investors. That's how corporations work. I'm not making a value statement here. This is a fact. The value statement that I am making is that this has no place in the housing market. So let's discuss the worst part about the corporate takeover of housing. Corporate landlords attempt to raise rents annually. Rent reductions are rare, they do happen, but it's temporary. For the most part, when you hear about the rental market cooling or a decrease in rents, what's being described is a decrease in the rate of increase, which is not the same as actual rents going down. According to the class action against RealPage, the company has been enabling rent hikes beyond conventional imagination. These are double-digit percentage increases in rent across the nation. Proptech algorithms give corporate landlords the confidence they need to screw us over. Think about that when you get next year's lease agreement. Corporate landlords don't care about their tenants. There's something inherently inhumane about a corporation. Probably their legal status as a person makes them feel like a skinwalker. Proptech makes it a lot easier for them to ignore the basic human needs of their tenants as well. In the words of Jeffrey Roper, the developer of RealPage's algorithm, "We said there's too much empathy going on here. This is one of the reasons we wanted to get pricing off-site." I'm working on my evil voices, I don't know. Proptech helps corporate landlords flag and track tenants that fall behind on payments. See, shareholders view these people as bad debt, something that every corporation is responsible to eliminate. How do you eliminate bad debt when it's a tenant, when it's a person? You evict them, and after eviction, that's a reset, baby. There's no lease to honor. Bring that rent as high as the algorithm tells you. Evictions are also a business practice for corporate landlords, even when tenants do pay on time. I mentioned earlier that some corporate landlords specifically purchase rent-stabilized units. This might seem odd at first, considering there's a cap on the amount that rent can increase. However, some cities and the entirety of California allow landlords to reset their rents every time a tenant moves out. This has led some corporate landlords to begin harassment campaigns against existing tenants to force them out, thus triggering a rent reset for the next lease. Part 3. Political action against corporate landlords. Nearly all new demand in the US has been met with rental units since 2010. The construction of homes for purchase has dropped significantly since the housing crash, while multifamily residential construction has seen historic highs. Until we end the commodification of housing, the market will never build enough units to cause meaningful rent decreases. The majority of units are owned by corporate landlords, and their control is growing. Corporate landlords are finding ways to work together, whether actively through collusion or passively through data reporting. Corporate landlords are building and buying up the majority of housing units, acquiring and merging with each other, and lobbying to end tenant protections. The larger and more connected they become, the less a competitor is able to undercut their rents and drive prices down. If all corporate landlords share the goal of increasing this year's profits, then all of them are going to employ the tactics I've detailed in this video. A public housing construction program that provides extreme affordability for everyone who wants it is the only supply-side solution guaranteed to create a disruptive competitor to the private market. Public housing would be free from the pressure to provide returns on investment to shareholders and thus inherently decommodified. I've noted the opportunities and challenges of this in detail in my other videos. I would hope that supply-siders can see that corporate landlords prevent their goals as much as they prevent the goals of tenant advocates. The larger these companies get, and the more data a rent pricing algorithm can pull from, the higher rents will climb. Even if you see a month of decrease here and there, the trend line is still going up. We had a housing market where corporate interests were the minority just 9 years ago. This isn't normal. I don't believe that anyone should want the market to continue like this. We need to work to achieve decommodified housing, and that should always be the goal of leftists and beyond. However, we are against corporate landlords who have unimaginable power and cash on hand. We need a housing movement that incorporates shorter-term goals. Here's what I believe a good leftist housing program should fight for in the immediate term. And again, I don't think this will solve the problem, but rather it's intended to give us the breathing room we need to push for bigger, more radical changes like a public housing construction program. Vacancy tax. Let's start with the vacancy tax. Landlords are withholding units. If you don't believe me, please put your head back in the sand. A vacancy tax is a fine for units that remain vacant for a certain period of time. Ideally, that revenue should be fed into the construction or maintenance of public housing. San Francisco just passed a vacancy tax that collects $2,500 to $5,000 per empty unit after they're vacant for 6 months. Let's talk about rent control. Rent control is effective and it's necessary. The problem is that when rent control is put on the table, landlords were organized to prevent it. This happened in St. Paul, and this is happening in Boston. And as I mentioned earlier, New York City landlords are withholding their units to get the state to weaken rent control there. These people are greedy. We do not need to be concerned with their wealth. We need rent control nationwide. Let's talk about ownership caps. This is probably the most difficult one to get public support for, but certainly the most effective way at removing corporate landlord dominance from your city. An ownership cap does exactly what it sounds like. It limits the total number of units a landlord can own within a certain geography. The North Carolina General Assembly's House Bill 114 would cap the number of single-family homes a landlord can own at 100. 100 is still a lot, but it's something. I've listed some political actions that are worth your energy. I can't tell each of you how to make moves on these. It's going to be different in every state, in every city. A lot of this just starts with a Google search. You can see what groups are already working on these, and if any of these sparked your interest, you can join those groups. I can pretty much guarantee you that someone has already started the work near you. I want to leave you with a final thought on corporate landlords, one that goes beyond legislation. While the situation is not ideal, there is one advantage to the size of a corporate landlord, and that's the ability to unionize against them. We're all familiar with labor unions, and maybe some are familiar with student debt unions. But there are also tenants unions, and they exist all over the country, playing a pivotal role in this fight. A tenants union can spark solidarity among renters who share a landlord. The bigger that union becomes, the more power they have to impede their landlord's extraction of wealth. It's not always going to work, and there could be severe repercussions to the tenants. But considering how much rent is going up and how much profit corporate landlords are sucking out of us, it's at least worth it to meet your neighbor for a radical chat. I really appreciate you sticking to the end. Thank you so much, and I'll catch you in the next one.